Greetings, welcome to a session here on grammar, English grammar. This series is going to be talking about English grammar primarily designed for teachers who will be teaching ESL students. Primarily we're going to be using information from this textbook here, the grammar book by Muria and Larson Freeman. If you're interested, you can go get this out of a bookstore near you. Today we're just going to be doing some introductions, and then we will move on to later chapters with later videos. This first chapter that they talk about here is relating just to the introductions of the differences between regular grammar teachers and grammar philosophies and ideas and those of the ESL teacher. So we're going to talk a little bit about the different types of approaches, the levels, nature, and dimensions of language, and then the pedagogical grammar. And then, of course, our challenge as language teachers. Let's begin by looking at some of these two different approaches that he says. Now, Muria, Larson Freeman, they talk about these two ends of the spectrum here, and I prefer to actually look at more of as a continuum. But let's take a look at the two ends first. We have the language approach, language use approach, and this is what you would consider, most would consider the communicative language approach, or the Krashonian style approaches to language use and language teaching. Basically, the language learner is using the language in some form of meaningful communication, and that's how they're going to learn. They're going to focus on communication. They're going to focus on using the language. They're not going to focus on language analysis, or they're not going to study grammar. They're not going to study vocabulary. They're going to have a more functional approach to language learning. That's at that one end, right? You have that. At the other end, of course, you have the more traditional language form, language analysis. This group of people are more of your grammarians, your grammar lovers, who want to analyze the grammatical structures, want to study vocabulary cards in long lists, out of context. The belief right now, anyway, so they have more linguistic analysis. They have a better opportunity to explain a grammar question because they study the grammar, they study the vocabulary. In my opinion, you should have the best of both of these worlds. You need to have a focus on form, and you need to have practical use, authentic communication. So there should be both of them there. Now, where you lie on this line, is going to be an issue. Whether you're going to be over here with the grammar lovers, or whether you're going to be over here with the osmosis language learners who just learn because they happen to be in the environment. There's a lot of research that indicates that both ends of these spectrums is not good. If you're interested in learning about how, well, there's lots of research for the language form people, and how these people, although they can dissect something, they can't communicate. So they can take a test and they can translate a piece of written work, but when you want to talk to them about something or take them out to a party, they're going to be stuck. At the same time, the language use people, they can probably communicate fairly well at a certain level, but if you want to go to higher levels of communication, they're going to have problems. If you want them to delve into academic style work, they're going to have great problems. And so my thought here is that you really should be in here somewhere, or in here somewhere where you have more of both ends. You've got some communicative and you have some focus on form. By doing this, you allow students to have more of a pragmatic approach to language learning, where they're actually using both sides of this paradigm. It would be interesting if I were to ask you who've learned language, how did you learn your language? Did you learn it by only being in the environment and listening to what people were saying, or did you also focus on grammar, focus on vocabulary at times, and have specific instruction or specific training or study in those areas? My guess is that those who have learned language sufficiently enough to go to school in another language had both. You may also have a preference as far as which is better for you as a language learner. And again, I've met students who say they prefer the osmosis method or the language use method. They prefer being in the environment. And then there are others who say, no, I want to be able to see and know what's going on. If I may also just make a point here, the brain works in interesting ways. When you're young and you're little, you don't have a lot of cognitive abilities to reason. And so, in my opinion, young tots are going to have more difficulty with the language form element because their brains are not developed enough to do that. As they get older and they hit pre-adolescence, they can now reason, and then you can use this. You can use the language forms better. So the little kids can pretty much only do language use, whereas older people can do both. And it would be to our advantage to use both of these skills in the brain. Okay, when you're little, you only have one. You can't talk abstractly about something with little kids, but you can do a lot of things with language use. When they get older, then you can do more with both sides. Okay, so anyway, those are the two approaches that he's referring to. They're the approaches that I would like to call, the grammar lovers and the osmosis group. And just a joke in and of itself, but I mean there are these two ends of the spectrum, and really we should be in the middle. We should be using a little bit of both of these. All right, enough for teaching approaches. Let's take a look a little bit at describing language, and a couple of different definitions here that the authors put in here. They have things described as the levels, the natures, and the dimensions related to language. Let's begin by just looking at the levels of language. We can begin by looking at the lower levels, or the morphology level. Morphology, as you will learn in later sessions, is dealing with the smallest meaningful units of language. So, for example, we have this word morphology. Well, morph is a morpheme, and ology is a morpheme. Ology means the study of. So we have two different things here. That at this level, the lower level of language study would be at the morphological or the subsentential level. At the sentence level, we have syntax, or your standard grammatical elements. You have things in here like the parts of speech. You have things in here like sentence construction, and things like, what's the word I'm looking for? Clause construction. And so that's where actually the bulk of our classroom is going to be in this area. And lastly, you have the suprasentential sentential level, and that's above the level of the sentence, and that would be discourse analysis and how we use grammar above the level of the sentence. So you'll be looking at cohesion, for example, how we connect sentences together, and how we link ideas together, or how we have multiple meanings for the same phrase depending on the discourse that it's in. So we've got three different levels. We've got the subsentential level, we've got the sentential level, and the suprasentential level. So we deal with little pieces, sentences, and then dialogue. Okay? It's one way that we can look at language. We can also look at language as a whole bunch of rules. Now, oftentimes you will read in the literature, they talk about the 4 skills. When you have an ESL book that you're going to be using to teach, you're going to talk about, the 4 skills. I like to say the 4 skills and the 2 databases, because lexically we have vocabulary and we have the grammar rules. And so I always call these the databases. The authors here call them the nature of the rules of language, right? And there are a lot of rules. We could put this in a little database and say, here are all the little rules that we need, and we can pull them out of the database whenever we need to explain or understand something. And so they're looking at the nature of rules, and a couple of points they wanted to point out. Nothing is etched in stone. These rules are rules that we, as linguists, write down after observation. Now, we may find out later on that our initial observations were wrong, so we need to change the rules. It used to be many years ago that someone would say, well, what is a noun? Well, a noun is a person, place, or thing. right? And for many years it was that way, and all of a sudden someone said, you know, we need to add something to this because, love is not a person or a place or a thing. Green is not a person, a place, or a thing. The color green, right, is my favorite color. Oh, well, that's a noun, but it's not a person, place, or thing. It's more of an idea or a concept, or a characteristic, you could even say, right? Well, no, it's got to be a noun. My bad. It's not etched in stone. They had to change the rules. That's my point. And so that's something that you need to recognize as you're studying the rules, that they're not etched in stone. They also sometimes appear arbitrary. Sometimes you have a rule, and a student will say, well, why do we have that rule? The answer, because we have that rule. Oftentimes there are reasons for it, but you don't necessarily need to explain it to your students because it may get convoluted or complex, or you may have to delve into history. But sometimes the rules don't appear to be logical, or they don't appear to be working in the same way in every situation, which is actually true. We'll talk about that sometime later as well. Finally, knowing the rules, and this to me is the most important step, knowing the rules is going to help you as a teacher. If you can explain to a student some of the general rules, for example, when to use an article, or the general rules for in, at, and on with regard to location or time, and you can explain that general concept, your students are going to be able to learn better. You're going to be able to teach better. So knowing what those rules are is going to be a tremendous help for you as a teacher. We recommend that you learn those rules. Let's go on to looking at the dimensions of language. Here we have the dimensions of language with regard to form, function, meaning, and use. The form is basically the syntax of it. It is how is it formed? How accurately are we putting these things together? This element here is basically the syntax, right? The grammar of it. If we look at language, right? This is the grammar of it. The next element here is the meaning, right? The meaningfulness. This is the content that we're trying to pull out. This would be the vocabulary. This would be the ideas encased in the words and the constructions that you're building, right? That's the meaning. What does it mean? How meaningful is it? And then lastly is, why do we use it, right? What's the practical end of it? When is it used? Why is it used? Okay, and this is be more over at the pragmatic level, at the discourse level of language use. When you're using language, all three of these elements are going to come into play. Am I using it appropriately? Okay, and then what does it mean? What is it that I want to say? And then how do I put it together? So you've got these three dimensions of language as well. Now, typically when we teach, we're not looking at all three of these. It's very good, though, to try to keep these together as you're teaching. Current practices in teaching language or teaching grammar is that you put the grammar focus within a communicative activity. There are times where you can just focus on just the form, just the grammar, okay? But usually you do it within the context of the whole circle. And that way you're trying to put all these pieces together as you go. It may mean that students, especially those that can use their noggin, it may mean that they're going to slow down initially. But as they're learning it in context so they can see the value of it. So when we're teaching language, and also when students are learning, they should be seeing all three of these dimensions. Yeah, I'm going to look at the form, I'm going to look at the grammatical structure, but I'm also going to look at the meaning. What does it mean? And then how appropriate is it to use in a particular setting? Okay, similar to when we were looking in the past at this one where we got morphology, syntax, and discourse. Here we're looking at it in a slightly different way. We're looking at the form of it, the meaning, and then how it's used. But you can see there are a number of facets to language when we're trying to teach it. Okay, and then again, this is just trying to give you an overview of all of the components that we're dealing with. Primarily for this course, we're going to be dealing with form more than anything. Because we want you to learn the rules so that you can use them when you're teaching your students. The authors then want to go on and talk about something that they call a pedagogical grammar. Typically, when you look at what linguists do, what linguists study or how they do research, they pick one of these elements here. They may pick corpus linguistics, they may pick cognitive linguistics, or, your traditional linguistics, and they do research in that area. They take this philosophy of language study. They take one of these components as a whole, and they pull it out, and they use that approach for studying the language. Now, we're not doing research in linguistics. We're not sitting in an office or developing tests so that we can put things down. We're not doing, corpus linguistics where we're going in and looking at a corpus and pulling out information from a database of material. No, we're teaching people how to learn language, and also we're teaching them language. So we got that dual element. So a good language teacher, according to the authors, and I think I would agree, I'm definitely an eclectic, is gonna take more of an eclectic approach. I'm going to use all of these possibly. I'm going to use any means possible to get the ideas, concepts, rules, and understandings into my students' minds so that they can acquire language. So it's going to be multifunctional. There are going to be times where I'm going to be using 2 or 3 of these ideas, these approaches at the same time in order to help my students learn. A little different from the traditional, I'm going to do work in cognitive linguistics, cognitive grammar. Well, I'm not just going to be in the mind. I want to use all of them. I may do things in the mind, but I may do things, with the morphology and jump into a lexical or a traditional. All going to be because I want my students to learn. So we, at the pedagogical level of grammar study, is more of an eclectic approach. Which means that the way that we learn language, the way that we teach language, is going to be multifaceted. Again, this is another word that I would approve of. Okay, a multifaceted approach. It's eclectic. We're doing a number of things with our students. One of the things we want them to do is we want them to acquire skills and knowledge. Okay, we want them to understand the rules that are involved with language. We want them to understand the knowledge base that's there in the database. So we're going to acquire the terminology so that they can become more autonomous language learners. What that means is not only do we want the students to learn that knowledge, but we want them to learn the skills to learn for themselves, right? So we want to become linguistic researchers. We're actually going to be going into these classrooms with ideas to help our students learn faster, and so we're kind of doing some type of research in our class. Gee, here's a method. Is it going to help them learn? We want them to learn that faster. So we become type of linguistic researchers. We're going to teach grammar as a skill. Okay, it's not just as a focus on the subject type of thing. When you go in and learn history, you're just learning history, right? You're just learning the components of history. But when you're going to be teaching grammar as a skill, in other words, you're not just learning all the rules. Hey, I'm going to learn all the rules. I'm going to learn how to learn the rules. Okay, I'm going to learn how to figure out what something means. Okay, so that, again, I can be an autonomous learner. Learning grammar is not the end. It is a means to an end. And we as language teachers want to be able to do that. We want to be able to infuse or impart to our students, would be a better word, impart to our students what the ways are to learn language so they don't need us anymore. They can be independent learners. Also, we want to recognize that this approach requires that we understand the learning process. The learning process for language study. It's not complex, okay? It's also not describable completely. There are elements that we can describe, but there are elements that we can't describe. And so there are some things that we're going to be able to do, that we're going to be able to paint a picture of what that particular element. Other parts we're not going to be able to do. I often would tell students that it's kind of like pointillism. If you remember that art style where they would take all these little dots, and they would form different shapes, and as you stepped back and look at it, all these little dots formed a picture. We as language teachers, we can teach a lot of the dots. We can't teach all of them. There's going to be gaps and spaces that we can't teach. And so there's going to be other ways where students are going to learn, right? There's also going to be a different process that students are going to learn because of their personal background. Their first language may be closer to English than other students. Their educational background might be different. And because you have those different elements when they come into wanting to learn English, it's going to be a different process for them. It's not going to be, the same all the time. So there are these different dimensions that are going to be involved in this learning process. So your students and you as a teacher need to recognize that there is this process that it goes through, but it's not really describable because of the variables that are involved, and because there are things that you can teach and things that they're too hard, they're currently indescribable, or we don't focus on them that way. There's so many facets that are involved that we want students to use this tool up here so that they can learn language themselves. And so that's why we have a multifaceted approach. We want to be eclectic. We want to focus on grammar. We want to focus on use. We want to focus on the vocabulary elements, and we also want to put them in context. We want to focus on the form of things, but we also want to use it in a meaningful way. So we want to use multiple ways of doing things. We want to not just do reading, but we also want to do writing and speaking. We want to use the whole person because that's the way language is. Even right now, I'm using all of these gestures. That's another thing that you can put into this mix. It's multifaceted. So we want to use techniques and approaches that meet the needs of our students. Okay, so some students are better learning by listening. Well, I'm going to have to modify what's going on with my teaching so that I can do that. Some are they learn by talking more. Some learn better because they can look at it. I've had students, when I was in a communicative course where you did a lot of communication and very little linguistic analysis, and they were frustrated because they wanted to see it on paper. They wanted to dissect it before they started using it. Okay, what are the needs of your students? Find out what they are. And then modify your approach, make it multifaceted because everybody's not going to be the same. Okay, present, practice, produce. I like this. These 3 P's. You're going to present it to your students. Here are the elements that you're going to be covering. You have them practice it, and then you have them produce something with it. In context, have them make it useful to them. Very nice little setup for when you're teaching grammatical elements in your classes. Okay. Next question that they wanted to bring up was which English do you teach? Do you teach my dialect? Do you teach another dialect? Do you teach the Queen's English? Do you teach proper British pronunciation? Which one do you do? The answer of which one is best is there are none that are best. What is the objective that you're trying to give for your students? Do you want them to have go to school or go to work in a British system? Well, then you better be teaching them British English. Do you want them to be going to Australia? Well, then maybe you want them to have some sort of Australian dialect or Australian vocabularies. I mean, obviously there are much overlap, but there are also differences. But there is no superior, there's no right or wrong. What should you be doing? Teach the dialect that you're strong in. If I've been asked to work somewhere and they want me to teach someone British English, I'm going to have a difficulty because there's a lot that I don't know. I should be teaching what I'm strong with, which would be my dialect. And then I should try to meet the students' needs. Now, if the students need someone who understands the British English, I'm probably not the teacher for them, even though I know English very well. You should probably get someone who has a British accent, who understands the British vocabulary in a way that I don't, right? Which one is best? Well, there is no best, but find out what your strengths are and use those. Lastly, prescriptive or descriptive. Love these 2 words. Prescriptive is basically telling a learner what is correct. Okay? Descriptive is trying to describe how it's used. Okay? When I was growing up, I was given only prescriptive. Teachers would tell you that's wrong. That's not correct. When in actuality, a prescriptivist is telling you how to use your language. And just a side note, these people annoy me. Because there is no right or wrong. Ain't absolutely is a word. Whether it's standard English is a different issue. Whether it's proper English is a different issue. We use language to communicate. And if you ain't up with that, well, then we're going to have a problem with communicating. But if you can understand you ain't up with that, that's perfectly good English. It's not standard English, but it's English. It does communicate. And when someone says, well, look, it's English, that's descriptive. Okay? When someone says to you, you ain't up with that, and you hear someone say, oh, that's not right, that's wrong, that's a prescriptivist. They're telling you what language is going to be correct instead of describing how it's used. Okay? See the difference between the two? Now, although I recognize that it's my language and I can do with it what I like, and if you don't like the words that I use, that's your problem, not mine, because it's my language. I own it. At the same time that I say I own it, if I'm trying to get a job at a company or at a university and I use my language, they also have every right to say, we don't want you here. Because they have that right. So, if you're trying to get into the university, for example, as a second language learner, I'm going to be teaching you standard writing procedure. Because I want you to get into the school. I want you to learn the standards that they require so you can get in. Now, is standard academic English the best English? No, it's simply the English that they use. There's two sides to the coin. Yes, it's my language, whether you like it or not. But if somebody doesn't like it, they may deny me access to something that I want to do. So it's good for me to learn that standard, whether be it British English or Australian English or American English or academic English or business English, whatever the standard is. If you want to get into their world, you better learn their language. Okay? Differences between the two. All right, what's our challenge? Our challenge is that we can't teach everything in grammar. As I mentioned before with this idea of pointillism, we can't teach everything. Won't have time. And we can't. There's things that we can't explain. There are things that we don't even think about metalinguistically, right? What we need to do is teach what they need the most. Okay? We need to teach them the grammatical structures that they need most. Okay, and we also need to teach them how to teach themselves. And to me, that's a very important thing. I often tell my ESL students, my job is to get rid of me. My job is to make it so that you can learn all by yourself. So you want to trust that they can learn themselves. You want them to become autonomous learners. That's one of the things that I'm going to be teaching them. Not only the grammar, but the skills to acquire more, right? I also want to build on existing knowledge. They have information that you can use in your language development. To me, this is always reminds me of when I was translating overseas. I would go, for example, to a church, and I would be the translator. And there were times where the speaker was using a passage of the Bible that I knew very well. And so even though he was using words that I didn't understand all of the words, I knew what he was talking about, and I could translate them. Because I had that background knowledge, right? It was easier for me to learn what was going on because I had the background knowledge. Students have background knowledge. If they have existing knowledge of grammar or of a particular content, use it to help them learn what's going on. Also, we as language teachers should know where the problems are. Okay, and this is one reason why we want to study grammar. We want to understand, for example, the grammatical exceptions to the rules. We want to know what would be a marked grammatical element and what wouldn't be marked, especially for a particular people group. Well, what's non-salient, or what something might have that might have multiple meanings. We want to know what these are so that we can take them and use them when we're teaching. So this means we need to understand the language, the form of the language, so that we can teach these, we can be ready for these when we encounter them in our teaching. Right? We need to understand that there are some things that are difficult to generalize as well. But our challenge is find a way to not only teach the basics, but also teach people to learn to teach for themselves so they can become independent learners. And we need to know where the difficult points are. Where are those those break points where students are actually going to need us to help them overcome them, especially at the beginning levels. And that's all that we have for this particular chapter. Again, this was introductions, kind of give an overview of what was going on. If you do have questions, you can certainly get a hold of me via email or at the bottom of this little lecture. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you.